Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wednesdays at the Center. Our center is a series that is hosted by the John Hope Franklin Center and the Duke University Center for International and Global Studies. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Felipe De Brigard, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at Duke University, who will be speaking on a topic called Perdón. To forgive is to remember differently. And it will be introduced by our own Dr. Miguel Rojas Sotelo, Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. So please remember at this time, keep your microphones muted, turn off your cameras, and if you have any questions or comments, please put it in the chat room. And also at the bottom of your screen, use the raise hand function if you want to ask Dr. Brigard any questions directly. So now at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Miguel Rojas Sotelo.
Thank you very much, Kevin. My name is Miguel Rojas Sotelo from the Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. After 5 years of the signature of the peace accords between the Colombian government and the FARC-EP, it's time to revise some of the most profound changes taking place. The promise of truth, justice, reparation, and no repetition has been set for 15 years. Within this framework comes forgiveness, and hopefully, at the end of the process, reconciliation. And with it, a possible closure, or better, to say an opening of opportunities for a better future for Colombians of all ways of life. The Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies has organized a series of events during the months of February, March, and April under the banner 5Y of Peace, to look at some aspects of such transition from conflict to reconciliation. History has told us that this is not an easy road and that there will be many bumps on the way. We invite you all to check the events and join the conversation. But today, to start this series, and thanks to the Wednesdays at the Center, we have Professor Felipe De Brigard, the Fochberg-Levine Family Associate Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience at Duke University, with his talk, Perdón. To forgive is to remember differently. Most of Felipe's research focuses on the way in which memory and imagination interact. So far, he has explored ways in which episodic memory both guides and constrains episodic counterfactual thinking. For example, thoughts about alternative ways in which past personal events could have occurred, and how this interaction affects the perceived likelihood of imagined counterfactual events. More recently, he is applying his work to the issue of forgiveness, perdón, in regards to victims of the Colombian conflict. The decades of conflict, which included bombings, massacres, kidnaps for ransom, extortion, forced displacement, target and random killings, etc., had had a heavy toll on the Colombian society. Through his work, De Brigard hopes to learn how memory affects forgiveness and how memories are affected by different ways to approach the act of forgiving. He's also tackling a question many Colombian survivors and survivors of violence worldwide are grappling with now. How do you help the person who cannot bring herself to forgive and yet wants to move on? To address these issues, Felipe De Brigard uses interviews, behavioral and functional magnetic resonance imaging techniques, as well as the conceptual rigor of philosophical analysis. Thanks, Felipe, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel, very much for that very nice introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, good, because I cannot see you. So, all right. So, thank you again for having me. It is really great to talk. And then I must say that this is the very first time that I am talking about the project. The project really just started. So what I'm going to tell you a little bit about is how is it that I came to do this project and sort of the history of this project. So the name of the project is called Forgetting and Forgiving, exploring the connections between memory and forgiving in Colombia. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background first. So I started off as a memory researcher. I am primarily a memory researcher, and I have been interested in false memories for a very long time. Now, false memories have been in the news, usually in negative connotations. So people know that it is very typical to falsely recognize perpetrators of crimes. And more recently, for instance, this just was from a couple of weeks ago. Once again, they were in the news about Prince Andrew claiming that the victim, his victim, was falsely remembering certain events. So false memories are almost always typically framed in this negative way. Like memories are fragile, liable, prone to modification, and they bring about negative consequences. I have written a lot about why is it that we have false memories. And one of my leading questions have been for a while, the fact that it will be very strange that we have a system that malfunctions so regularly. In other words, if a false memory is the malfunction of a memory system, then why on earth do we have a memory system that malfunctions so frequently and so systematically? A lot of my work has tried to tackle this question by suggesting that the reason why we have false memory, that the reason why this question doesn't really make a whole lot of sense is because we are getting the function of memory wrong. So if the function of memory was to reproduce past experiences with fidelity, then it would be very strange that it malfunctions so regularly. By contrast, if we think of memory as doing something else altogether, something that I called a inverse problem, or following lots of computational accounts of memory, then it doesn't seem to be that surprising that sometimes memory malfunctions or generates false memories in the way in which it does. So a lot of my work have been on trying to understand what is exactly what memory does if it is not faithful reproduction, and why and how it generates false memories. So again, a lot of, as Miguel was saying at the beginning, a lot of my research has been on how memory and imagination interact, particularly at retrieval. And as I mentioned, a lot of that research on how they interact has focused on negative consequences of this interaction, like false recollections of in witness testimony and so on and so forth. But let us step back for a second and ask a different question. Why is it that there is this interaction between memory and imagination at retrieval? Why does it have to occur to begin with? And is it possible that it has positive consequences as opposed to just negative consequences, the one that we hear so often and so typically in the news? So I started to be interested in positive consequences of the interaction between imagination and recollection at the time of retrieval as a result of this one experiment that I published a few years back. In this experiment, I was interested in seeing what would happen when people generate a counterfactual simulation of something that could have occurred in their past. All of us have done this many times. You know, suppose that you miss a date because the alarm clock didn't go off, and then as a result of that, say you missed out on the opportunity of getting a job. That's the typical thing that people regret a lot, right? And they think a lot about what they would have done in the past. Oh, if only I had, you know, set the alarm, a second alarm, or if only I hadn't gone to bed too late the night before, and so on and so forth. So what I asked participants to do in this study was to repeatedly simulate regretful counterfactual events. And as expected, the more people simulated the event, the more detailed that simulation became, and also the easier it was to bring that episodic counterfactual thought to mind. But interestingly, we saw that the more people thought about what could have happened, the less likely they thought is that the event could have occurred. So we see here a disconnect between the amount of detail and ease and the perceived plausibility of the event. And at that point, I thought, well, this makes a lot of sense. Why do you want to spend a lot of effort into thinking about a possible event that could have occurred if, if that possibility, as it were, is closed off? So you want to use imagination to stop worrying about your past, right? I should say that this occurs with neurotypicals. We have an entire different research line in my lab looking at not neurotypical regret-producing contractual thinking. But anyways, at this point, I call this the coming to grips with the past the effect. The idea being that we engage in episodic contrafactual thinking, we engage in that kind of imagination to help us to come to grips with the past. Now, how is it that imagining an event that could have occurred when you're recollecting that event influences the content of the retrieved memory? Well, according to the traditional view, when you have an experience, you encode this experience. I hope you all are seeing my cursor. You encode the experience, and the experience is at the beginning unstable, right? That in fact, if you take some drug that would produce amnesia in you, the memory, for instance, can be so unstable that it doesn't get consolidated. But according to the traditional view, once time passes, that memory gets consolidated and becomes more stable. And then later on, when you retrieve it, you reactivate the memory. Now, what we have known from the past couple of decades is that the act of retrieving the memory renders that memory unstable or labile again. So the memory here becomes labile and unstable. So there has been a lot of work showing how after the memory is reactivated and is unstable, it has to undergo another process of consolidation that they call reconsolidation. And when you alter that process of reconsolidation, then you can modify the content of the original memory once again, right? So there is a lot of work nowadays using not only pharmacological interventions and neuronal or brain stimulation, but also behavioral therapies to help people modify the contents of those memories upon reactivation and right before reconsolidation. So this was the idea. In fact, I started doing a series of studies showing how contrafactual thinking, imagining alternative ways in which past events could have occurred but didn't, influences one very well-known effect in memory. This effect in memory is called the fading affect bias. Namely, when you have a negative memory, typically when you don't remember it a whole lot, what occurs is that the valence of that memory goes down. In other words, negative memories become a little bit less negative. Okay, here the less negative is indicated by going up. Okay, but what we have discovered is that when you engage in contrafactual thoughts, particularly in regret-producing contrafactual thoughts, you prevent that fading affect from occurring. In other words, when it would be normal change in emotion, but you start with negative memories here that show no difference, but then you show a difference as a function of whether you engage in contrafactual thinking down here, or if you did not engage in contrafactual thinking. Not engaging in contrafactual thinking helps the fading affect bias to occur. So in other words, I just found the very obvious thing that regret is bad for your memories because it helps you not, or it prevents you from more easily coming to grips with the past. And in fact, we have used some of these techniques for imagining alternative ways in which past events could actually have been worse rather than better, what is called downward contrafactual thinking, in individuals with anxiety. And in a very recent paper we just published earlier this year, we show that engaging in downward contrafactual thinking reduces perceived regret even more so than temporal distancing, which is one of the most widely used techniques of emotional prescripting in cognitive behavioral therapy. So it turns out that there are certain ways in which we can imagine our past having occurred that are very powerful in helping us to cope and to live with the past. So, within this context of all this kind of research that I have been doing, looking at the interactions between imagination and memory at the time of retrieval, and in particular contrafactual thinking at the time of retrieval, it became pretty clear to me that we are actually constantly using imagination to modify the affective contents of previous autobiographical experiences so that we can more easily carry our past. I mean, after all, we carry our memories with us, and it would be very nice if those memories of negative events didn't hurt as much every time that we remember them. And in fact, I have been trying to show that we can actually use episodic counterfactual thinking during memory reactivation for the better, for improving people's life, essentially allowing them to remember traumatic or bad experiences in a much better light. This way of thinking about it then suggests that the use of counterfactual thinking could be used as an emotional reappraisal strategy during memory reactivation. So all of this is nice and good, but then I started thinking, well, what about other psychological states that can help us to modify the contents of negative autobiographical memories for the better? So I have studied a whole lot of counterfactual thinking, but could it be other kinds of psychological states that we can engage in at the time of retrieval that might help us to modify those contents? And about 3.5 years ago, I started to think a little bit about forgiveness in particular, whether forgiveness was a cognitive process by means of which we do something like that, in which we change and modify somehow the contents of the original memories. After all, when you suppose that you're giving the possibility of completely erasing a past wrongdoing that someone did to you, that doesn't seem to be equal to forgiving, right? So it looks as though in order to forgive, you must still be able to remember what happened. But also, it looks as though you remember it differently. So could it be possible that forgiveness, or one of the mechanisms that undergirds forgiveness, is something similar to this kinds of mechanisms of emotional reappraisal that I have been studying in counterfactual thinking? So at this time, I was just sort of thinking very generally about this idea of forgiveness and emotional reappraisal. But then we're talking about 3 years ago, there were two events that happened almost at the same time. The first one is that I went to Colombia, to Bogota, to give a talk in something unrelated. I think it was on counterfactual thinking and control. And then at dinner, I had dinner with my very good friend, Santiago Amaya, who is a professor in the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. And I told him that I had this kind of crazy idea that forgiveness might be something like emotional regulation, and that and I started to read a little bit of philosophy of forgiveness, and I started to realize that it might be possible to think of forgiveness in terms of emotional reappraisal. And Santiago turned that to me and said, like, get out of here. I am literally writing that paper. And he was at the time writing the paper, which is a great paper. It's called Forgiving as Emotional Distancing. So at that point, I said, like, I think you're exactly right, I said to Santiago. And I actually believe that we can collect data that actually supports that philosophical view. I think that this dovetails very nicely with the way in which I've been thinking about imagination and memory. And I think that we should do it. And Santiago said, that's a great idea. And then the second event is that I got tenured. And when I got tenured, I decided I want to do something big. I want to do something that it is going to be helpful, that it is going to bring, some good to the community more in general. I wanted to engage in a more risky project, if you want. So I started to think at that point on really doing a serious project on exploring how memory and forgiveness interact. And specifically, I wanted to test the hypothesis that forgiveness impacts the affective as opposed to the cognitive components of autobiographical memories of past wrongdoings. So to tease this apart, when you remember an event, you can remember lots of things of the event. You can remember not only, for instance, the details of the event, who was there, where it was, when it happened, and so on. You can also remember emotions. You can also remember the affective components of the memory. And in addition to that, there is an affective component of the memory at the time of retrieval. Typically, most research shows that these components are different and they're somehow distinct from one another. So I just basically group them into cognitive, having to do with details and space and so forth, and affective, those having to do with the valence and the emotions of the memory. So the hypothesis then is to see whether forgiveness actually impacts the affective as opposed to the cognitive components. I call that memory mollification as opposed to memory modification, right? And next, the thought is that if forgiveness actually involves the emotional reappraisal of past wrongdoings, could alternative emotional reappraisal strategies employed in autobiographical memory research increase people's tendencies to forgive? In other words, what if we use other kinds of strategies for emotional reappraisal of autobiographical memories? Would that improve the chances of people to bring themselves to forgive the perpetrators? And then the last issue was whether we could actually put these ideas to test in a population of victims of political violence in Colombia. So that's how the project started. But in order to get a project going, you need at least two things. On the one hand, you need to gather some pilot data that indicates that the project is feasible. And at the same time, you also need to gather a good team that makes the project possible. So I'm going to tell you about these two parts in what follows. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the pilot data, which we just finished and we're writing up for publication. And then I'm going to tell you about the team. So the pilot data is now directed by Gabriela Fernandez, of whom I am going to talk about in a second. She is a first-year grad student here at Duke and is working in the project with me. And Sam Murray, who is my postdoc, also came to Duke from getting a PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. This was also in collaboration with Matt Stanley, who was my graduate student here at Duke, but now he's a postdoc at Fuqua, well, still at Duke, and Leonard Fault, who is also my graduate student and still a graduate student here at Duke, 5th year by now. All right, so I'm gonna walk you a little bit through the studies. So to give you some background to motivate the studies, so one of the most typical accounts of forgiveness is what we call the emotional account. And it traces back at least to Bishop Joseph Butler, and people typically trace it back to 2 sermons on forgiveness and resentment that he wrote and delivered in 1726. In those, Butler talks about forgiveness as the forswearing or the overcoming of resentment, as if forgiving essentially involves this feeling of overcoming resentment. In more contemporary times, several philosophers have argued in favor of an emotional account of forgiveness that involves essentially this overcoming of resentment. But the question is, how does this change in emotion occur? And now, as expected, philosophers disagree quite widely. So for instance, one of the initial sort of more influential views about how this emotional change occurs is owed to Pamela Hieronymi, a professor at UCLA. Her argument is that we have this emotion change because we revise our judgment on the perpetrator or on the wrongdoing. So when the perpetrator commits a particular action or a particular wrongdoing, our initial judgment is that that person is not only doing something wrong, is also that that person is responsible and that person deserves blame. That person is blameworthy. Then later on, when we revisit that event and we forgive, what we're doing, according to Hieronymi, is that we're revising the judgment on the original judgment on the perpetrator and the wrongdoing, and we no longer consider that perpetrator blameworthy or responsible for the action. Now, that account brings about lots of difficulties with it. One of the difficulties that it brings about, for instance, is the fact that it seems very strange that if you no longer consider the person to be blameworthy, then forgiveness is no longer required, right? Forgiveness is only required if the person is blameworthy. If you are not blameworthy for what you did, then you don't need to be forgiven. You should be just excused, kind of like my dog when he steps on my gardenias. I cannot forgive him for doing that, but I can excuse him for doing that. He didn't know better and stuff like that. So that's one concern with Hieronymi. So in response, many have argued for other sources of this emotion change. So for instance, Blunstein has argued that the reason why there is this emotional change is because we actually forget bits and pieces of the original event of the wrongdoing. So I call that the cognitive forgetting account. Because we forget details of the wrongdoing, then the sort of it piggybacks on this change in emotion with fewer details, then remembering the event doesn't hurt as much. The account that I favor, and I think that Santiago Amaya favors, is that actually you don't need to forget the emotional detail, the cognitive details of the memory. Instead, what you're doing is that you are reappraising the emotional content of the memories of the wrongdoings rather than the cognitive contents. So in order to try to sort of tell apart between those cognitive forgetting versus the emotional distancing approaches, we conducted a series of studies. So the first aim of the pilot study was to identify the differences in the experience of autobiographical recollection of past wrongdoings, to see whether it depends or not on the perpetrator has been forgiven. The second objective is to test whether these potential differences are due to changes in the cognitive and or in the affective content of the original memory of the wrongdoing. And finally, we wanted to explore whether differences in the experience of remembering past personal wrongdoings predict tendencies toward forgiveness, benevolence, and revenge. So we conducted a series of these were online studies here prior to submitting the grant. The first one is between subjects design. It was very straightforward. I know that not everyone in the audience has a background in psychology, but bear with me. I'm trying to make this as clear and as straightforward as possible. The studies are pretty straightforward. It's very simple. All we asked people was to recall an event in which someone else harmed them either emotionally or physically in the past 10 years. And then participants were randomly assigned to either a forgive or a not forgive condition. That is to say, a condition in which they forgave the perpetrator, or they were asked, they put in a condition in which they did not forgive the perpetrator. The participants simply had to write 4 to 6 sentences of the event, and then they completed what is called the memory characteristics questionnaire, which is a very well validated questionnaire that explores the characteristics of our experiences of recollection. And basically the results are pretty straightforward. We see no difference in any of the cognitive components of forgiven versus unforgiven wrongdoings. In other words, there was no difference in how well people remember the sounds, the smells, the colors, the locations, and so on and so forth, in memories of past wrongdoings in which they either forgave or did not forgive the perpetrator. There was also no difference in how they judged, how they felt during the event. However, we did find significant differences in the way in which, so no differences in the way in which they saw the valence or the intensity of the event back then, but there was a significant difference in the way in which they experienced the event now at the time of retrieval, as well as the level of intensity with which they experience the event now at the time of retrieval, making it less negative for those that forgave and less intense for those that forgave. Additionally, we found that that they tended to ruminate, that people that people that were in the condition of not forgiving, they tended to ruminate on those unforgiven events more often than those that did forgive. All right. Now in study 2, we were simply interested on seeing whether there was differences in what is called the centrality of the event, which is how important do we think this event is in our life and in our identity. Very simple experimental design again. Participants were randomly assigned to either the forgive or not forgive condition, and they were asked to recall an event in which someone else harmed them emotionally or physically in the past 10 years. Again, in the participants that were in the forgive condition were asked to retrieve a memory of that event in which they forgave the perpetrator, and those that were in the not forgiven condition were asked to remember that event in which they didn't forgive the perpetrator. Again, write a short paragraph and then complete the centrality of event scale, which was developed actually here at Duke. And what we find is that victims who forgave the perpetrator evaluated the wrongdoings as less central to their identity and as less important to their current lives relative to those that did not. And this is very much in line with the idea that events that are more central to our life, that we perceive to be more important, are more ruminated upon and thought about. Now, because I'm a memory researcher, I'm always very interested on ruling out effects that are simply due to time passing. So that was one of the purposes of doing this third study. In this study, we wanted to see whether there was a difference in the role that you play. So sometimes when you commit certain acts, you could be the victim, but sometimes you can be the perpetrator. So what we wanted to see here was to see whether there were differences as a function of whether you were a victim or a perpetrator. In other words, if forgiveness has one direction of effect. So so it is a 2x2 design. We have participants to be in one of 4 possible conditions. One condition in which they were the victim and the perpetrator they were the victim and they forgave the perpetrator, or they were the victim and they did not forgive the perpetrator, or they were the perpetrators and the victim forgave them, or they were the perpetrators and the victim did not forgive them. Once again, they had to recall an event, write 4 to 6 sentences, and complete the memory characteristics questionnaire. Here, what we find, once again, replicating the previous studies, is that there were no differences whatsoever on the cognitive components, regardless of role. So in the case of the perpetrator, there were no differences in the cognitive components. But in addition to that, there were no differences in the intensity or the valence then, how it is remembered, regardless of role. However, when you are the victim, which I am indicating here, the valence is actually reduced. In other words, if you have forgiven the person, the perpetrator, then you remember that event less negatively relative to if you have not forgiven the perpetrator. But this is only the case when you're the victim, and it is not the case when you are the perpetrator. Likewise, for the intensity then, the remembered intensity doesn't change at all, but you see a difference here in the intensity. When you have forgiven, the intensity is not as high relative to when you have not forgiven. And this only occurs for the victim and not so for the perpetrator. So this is an important confirmation that we're talking about forgiveness in the direction of from the victim to the perpetrator and not the other way around. Now, the 4th study was simply a correlational design because we're now interested. Okay, so we have a good sort of idea of differences in the memory of past wrongdoings as a function of whether you forgave or not. But now, do we have any idea of how the way in which you remember these past wrongdoings actually affect other reactive attitudes, right? In particular, we're interested on the reactive attitudes that are measured by what is called the transgression-related interpersonal motivation inventory, which is a questionnaire that assesses avoidance, revenge, and benevolence motivations in response to individual transgressions. So again, very simple design. We ask them to ask participants to simply recall one event in which someone else harmed them emotionally or physically in the past 10 years. And then we asked them whether they forgave the person who harmed them, and they had 3 options: yes, no, or maybe. We used the subset of the memory characteristics questionnaire in which we found the differences before, the valence and the intensity and the rumination, and then we gave them the trim. That's very straightforward design. And what we find here again, these results are really pretty because, so this is the midpoint in the red dotted line. So what we find is not only that avoidance and revenge tendencies are significantly higher for the not forgiven versus forgiven perpetrator. So people that do not forgive tend to have higher ratings of revenge relative to those that did forgive. And likewise in avoidance, so when you forgive, you're less likely to want to avoid the perpetrator relative to when you forgive. And this is a nice stepwise, you see relation here with the maybe kind of like in the middle. And it is also the case that the feelings of benevolence go the other way around. If you have forgiven, you have more feelings of benevolence toward the perpetrator relative to when you have not forgiven. But the most important point, which I don't have plotted here, is that the valence and the intensity of your recollection of the wrongdoing predicts this difference in benevolence, avoidance, and revenge. So that's a really nice result. Could it be possible, and this were some thoughts that we just did very recently, Gabriela and Sam, which I mentioned at the beginning, conducted this last studies. Could it be possible that this interaction between the way in which we remember a past wrongdoing and the way in which it affects our subsequent feelings of benevolence, revenge, and closeness, could it be possible that it is modulated by how severe do we think that the wrongdoing was, and also by how close are we to the perpetrator? So to test that question, to evaluate the question, we asked once again to recall the event in which someone else harmed them. And it was again between subject designs. Half of the participants were in the forgive condition and the other half were in the not forgive condition. We gave them again the trim that measures benevolence and so on, which we just saw in the study before. But also we asked them about the severity of the event and how close they were to the perpetrator. So by severity, we mean how important, not only how severe the event was, but also how important were the consequences of the event in your life, and how negatively it affected your relationship with the perpetrator. And also how close were you to the perpetrator. We used the inclusion of others scale, which is a very cute scale in which you are identified here as the self and as the other, and you basically have to choose how interconnected with that other you are. So that's how this scale works. And basically the results that we identified before, forgiveness once again is associated with an increase in benevolence toward the perpetrator and reduced feelings of revenge and avoidance. But very interestingly, avoidance is predicted by the severity and the closeness and also the condition. So this is kind of like a tricky plot to read, but basically what it means, so the higher the number here, the more positive the number, the stronger is going to be the correlation, right? So the stronger the severity of the action is thought to be, and the least close you feel the perpetrator is to you, the more you want to avoid it. Right? And by contrast, the closest, so this is here, but notice that this is in the unforgiveness. So you see the same happens in the forgiveness, but it is not as marked. In the unforgiveness condition, you pretty much want to avoid it, and the closer it is to being really severe and more distant to you. But by contrast, you look at the other side, in the forgiveness condition, you tend to, like, the correlation tends to be smaller, but in the unforgiveness condition, only, when you're really close to someone and you think that it is not that it is severe, that's when you find more correlation. So this is interesting because severity and closeness and conditions really modulate how much you want to avoid the individual later on. And this one is also very interesting. It's kind of a tricky to interpret because it's a three-way interaction. But basically, what we find here is that on those that are close to you, which are in red, those that are close to you, the more, there's not a whole lot of a difference, the more severe the action is. But those that are distant, if you forgive them, you tend to think more benevolently toward them, regardless of the severity of the action. But if you don't forgive them, there is a huge drop in benevolence as a function of how severe that action is. So this is a very nice sort of proof of concept that even with people that are very distant to you, right, forgiveness really does manage to reduce or to increase your feelings of benevolence toward that person relative to when you do not forgive the individual. So in sum, what we have seen in this pilot data is that autobiographical memories of forgiven wrongdoings are experienced as less negative, less intensely, less central to one's life and identity, and are ruminated upon less relative to those of unforgiven wrongdoings. This effect is only evident for memories in which one is the victim, not when one is the perpetrator. Forgiving the perpetrator correlated with increased levels of benevolence toward them and reduced sense of revenge and avoidance. And these associations are actually modulated by the perceived severity of the wrongdoing, as well as how close the victim is to the perpetrator. Great. So that was the first point, to gather the data. The data speaks in favor of our hypothesis, and it suggests that our manipulations and our experiments might be conducive to a much larger kind of project. So the next step, as I mentioned, was not only to gather data, but now to gather the team. And I was very lucky to gather a fantastic team to work with me. So the first person that I gathered was Santiago Amaya, with whom I spoke, the philosopher at the Universidad de los Andes. And next, I also team up with a long friend, like a friend of mine has been friends for many, many, many years. So is Santiago, but Pablo is, I met him when I was an undergrad. I don't even want to tell you how long ago that was. And he's a political scientist and an economist who has been doing a lot of work with the Centro de Memoria Histórica in the Universidad Tecnológica Bolívar in Cartagena for quite some time, and knows a lot of groups of victims and perpetrators. I have been working with them very closely for a long, long time. Wilson Lopez, whom I actually didn't know until I started working in this project, and now is just a really wonderful human being to be with. Wilson is one of the, I guess, clinical psychologists that knows the most about peace and reconciliation in Colombia. And on the American side, I've been working with Kevin Labar here at Duke, who knows a ton about memory and emotion, and with Professor Lucia Lai, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Johns Hopkins half-time, and the other half-time is at Wit University in Johannesburg. And not only she knows a lot about the philosophy of forgiveness, she also knows a lot about the apartheid, and has had an experience because she's from South Africa and has done a lot of work during the apartheid there. So that was the team. Next, we needed to find the place, and the obvious place was to work with Pablo and Montes de Maria. So the population that we're working with very closely are all in this area of Montes de Maria. Many of you might be familiar with it, but I just tried to put together some maps. These mountains here to the right are from San Juan Nepomuceno, the mountains of San Juan Nepomuceno. This is basically paradise. It's absolutely gorgeous. Montes de Maria comprises 15 municipalities or municipios, and we have participants from pretty much all of them, and we're going to be collecting data from all of these 15 municipalities, even though a lot of our centers of operation is going to be in San Juan de Nepomuceno, but there's going to be some work center also in the Carmen de Bolívar. So that is the population. Montes de Maria, as you might know, is one of the regions in Colombia that was more, badly hit by the violence. There were lots of civilians displaced and killed by crossfire between the guerrillas and the paramilitaries. In fact, Carmen de Bolívar, when I was growing up in Bogota, was really the heart of what is called the Zona Roja, or the red zone. It was just basically impossible to think of ever going to any of these areas when I was, a kid or a teenager, when I was still living in Bogota, and the conflict was, pretty bad. So you can probably imagine my emotion when, and I must say, I have traveled to every nook and cranny in Colombia when I was much younger, but never made it to Carmen de Bolívar, and I always wanted to. So you can imagine my emotion when I took this picture in December from La Canzona, overlooking all the Carmen de Bolívar here, an area that I never imagined I would ever go to because it was Zona Roja, and now is extremely peaceful. So this is the area we're looking at. So the good news, and it's funny that I am going to almost finish with this part, but we finally got the grant, and the grant started in July of last year. That's when we got it from the John Templeton Foundation, and we started, to enlarge the group. Now we have Sam and Gabriela here at Duke working with me, but also in the Colombia team, we have Mario Fernandez and Juan Diego Rodriguez in Bogota as research assistants, and Maria Jose Martinez in Cartagena as a research assistant as well. There are some other members of the team that I am not mentioning here for various reasons, including security reasons, but we have other people among the victims and the leaders there in the north of Colombia that are helping us very closely in the project. And right now, we're just basically starting, but one of the aims of the project is to start the first biophysiology lab at the UTB. So I literally just made the order for all the equipment today, right before this talk, which should be arriving to my office next month. And we're going to take it there to the Universidad Tecnológica Bolívar and install it. Another one of the big projects, there's a part of this that happens in Bogota, and there's a part that is happening with indirect victims, and there's a part that is happening here at Duke. But one of the main projects too or aims, I guess, is to involve victims and perpetrator in the process of doing science and philosophy in Colombia. So many of the people that we're working with are not only participants in the study, they are really active researchers that are helping us, that are learning how to code, that are learning how to conduct interviews, how to do a statistical analysis, and so forth. We also want to work very closely with the community in Montes de Maria to identify mental health needs. A lot of the work that we're doing is, of course, very sensitive, and so people, it's hard. If you have ever done it, it's difficult. And the hope is that we can also help to identify mental health needs and strategies to cope. And finally, our hope too is to contribute with all the knowledge that we have, we will be acquiring in the next 3 to 5 years to the Justicia Especial de Paz, to the transitional justice piece, in the hopes that the victims are really heard, and that forgiveness takes the role that it should take to improve the conditions of everyone, and also importantly to not make people forget, because that's another very, very important. So my hope is to show that forgiveness does not involve the forgetting of the details of past wrongdoings. It involves the reassessing of the affect, but memory and forgiveness can both coexist. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Felipe. This has been an incredible way to start 5Y of peace in Colombia, with such a profound way to look at one of the core issues on the process of reconciliation. That is the issue of forgiveness, right? And I think you have brought not only academic knowledge, know-how, but these two dimensions that always collide in these processes of reconciliation, in the process of justice, that is the hard data, what you call cognitive dimension, right? The details, the facts, what happened, and the affective dimension, right? The emotional dimension, and how these two are completely connected and embedded in the processes of memory, and how they are somehow one of the same, but they are different, and how do they interact with each other when we talk about this process of revenge versus benevolence, or forgiveness or not forgiveness, and I think it's a very important way to collaborate in this process of reconciliation. And thank you so much. I do have many questions, but of course,
I got a few in the chat too, so you must have
there are a few in the chat. Then let's start with them. I mean, I have lots of people saying hi, welcome. But if you want to take one of them,
a couple from direct message. Should I start with those?
Go for the direct messages, because I didn't get those.
Kevin asked, where is the source of rumination about the negative experience come from? So that depends. So one answer is to say, look, you want to be able to re-simulate past negative experiences, likely because you want to hedge future uncertainty, right? So you engage, remembering is not only about the past, it is also to help you to simulate possible events that might occur in the future, and then to act in accordance to that. And one of my favorite expressions that comes from Karl Popper is to say that he said that hypothesis, that we generate hypotheses so that they can die in our stead. Well, I think that we generate hypothetical simulations so that they can die in our stead. You generate alternative ways or imagine ways in which events happen or could have happened in order to hedge future uncertainty. So I think that rumination healthy amount of rumination has the purpose of improving your future behavior. Unhealthy rumination has, is that process on steroids. So you want to be able to do it a little bit, but not a whole lot, because when it is a whole lot, then it becomes debilitating. So my answer to the source will be this sort of combo of mechanistic and evolutionary reasons as to why they come from. Now, Montez Snyder asked any insight on why people forgive or do not forgive. Wow, that's a very big question. I think that the motivations vary. One thing that it is pretty clear for everything that I have read is that forgiving actually is very helpful for your mental health. Oftentimes forgiveness, release certain kinds of negative emotions that you rather don't have. So I think that a lot of people really bring themselves to forgive because forgiveness just brings some kind of peace to their mind. Now, the tricky thing is that it's very hard to forgive. It's extremely hard. Like I cannot go to the lab and ask participants, remember some wrongdoing. Okay, great. Now forgive the perpetrator. That's just not going to happen. That's just not a possible manipulation. Forgiveness is sometimes very, very, very difficult. So even though there are people that would like to forgive because there are all these mental health benefits to forgiveness, they cannot bring themselves to do it. One of the objectives of my research, or our research, I should rather say, is to try to figure out whether if we are right in that one of the mechanisms, or perhaps the pivotal mechanism, the critical mechanism for forgiveness is the emotional reappraisal of memories of past wrongdoings, then it might be possible that you can use alternative emotional reappraisal strategies that could bring about the beneficial health that you want from forgiveness without necessarily you having to forgive. Here's I put now my philosopher's hat, but I think that there are very good arguments for why is it that forgiveness is not morally obligatory. That is to say, is not something that you ought to do. In fact, I think that there are very good arguments for instances in which the offenses and the wrongdoings are unforgivable. And the question is, well, how can I get the mental health benefits of forgiveness when I myself am facing what it is clearly an unforgivable offense? That is to say, an offense for which it would be morally wrong to forgive. So my thought is, well, I think that you can live without forgiveness and move on if you engage in other emotional reappraisal strategies. So that's sort of the thought. But there is no single answer to why people forgive or don't forgive. I think that there are lots of different motivations for people bringing about to do so.
Yeah, and following that, I have a question about the experiment on number 3, the one of the roles.
Yeah.
Here, what is very interesting here, and that is the opportunity that has been opened in this process in Colombia, is the possibility to hear from victims, but also from perpetrators, right? And have these roles clearly defined in this process. Then I'm not sure I'm wrong in the way I heard your conclusions, but that for perpetrators it's harder to forgive. Probably because, of course, they are forgiving an act that is performed by themselves in the past, and even the distance, while they can change, right, modify their, in the reconciliation of the memory, there is guilt, right? Mm-hmm. Then forgiveness and guilt somehow plays a role in their side, in the role that for them is harder to forgive. That is an interesting finding, because when you think about a perpetrator, you think that a person that commits a violent act has to somehow codify that act in order to distance, avoid the bad consequences for their identity, right, their personhood, right, because diminish their humanity. But I don't know, how do you take it?
I mean, that's also a great point. So one thing, I mean, I should say that one of the things that I like the most about the projects that I engage in is the amount that I learn in the process and that I just didn't know when I was first starting. So for instance, it seems extremely easy to dichotomize the actors of the conflict into victims and perpetrators. Oh, how wrong are we? That is just very difficult. I work with a number of individuals that are so difficult to classify as whether they're victims or perpetrators. So trigger warning, I'm going to tell a little story that it is not that pleasant to hear, but one of the individuals that I work with is this woman who was a former guerrilla member, and as a result is a person that had killed personally several people. At the same time, she was repeatedly raped and sexually abused by the commander in her battalion. So there is an enormous amount of victimhood going on in her, but she's also a perpetrator of some actions. This is all within a very complex context of the conflict. Do you classify her as a victim, or is she a perpetrator? Is this something that it is going to, so these lines get blurred very quickly, right? A number of people that for the reason, and there is a sense in which she might have been a victim in part because she comes from a place that if you don't become a guerrilla member, you become a cadaver. So it's very complicated to do it in this specific way. So the categorization of victim and perpetrator is already very tricky. Because I approach this from a scientific perspective, I need to control for what philosophers call moral standing. So one of the questions in forgiveness is, who is in standing to forgive a perpetrator? So, and it's very tricky because there are like third parties that could forgive and so on. So I need to be able to control for that. So the people that are participating as participants in our study so far are direct victims, which is defined basically or operationalized as victims that either directly suffered themselves damage or were, for instance, the survivors of massacres, they have their family killed and so forth. So that's very direct victimhood. And indirect victims, which are people like me, say, who grew up in Bogota, knew of people that got kidnapped or parents of my friends that got killed and so on and so forth, but I never had anyone really close to me being affected. Nevertheless, we feel that we were victims of the violence, but indirectly, right? So there you have those two levels. There's lots of other ways of thinking about actors in the conflict. For the purpose of this study, just to begin with, at least, we are classifying them in this more controlled way because we're really interested on the memory of direct victims and also the memory of indirect victims. Later on, I hope to be able to expand it to perpetrators, for instance. What you were saying, self-forgiveness for perpetrators is a huge issue. That's another interest of mine, of how people that have committed wrongdoings remember their memories. But you know, there is so much that I can do, and this is already a lot to chew.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, because my other question, it's also going there, is here we have the individuals, right, going through this, that are going to go through this, and at the end we are trying to complete a process of a healing of a nation, right, that goes beyond the individual in these blurring lines, victim or not victim, perpetrator or not, right, and a society as a body, right, a society that also has memory, right, a country with memory, or a country that has to forgive in order to move on, right? It's a more philosophical dimension.
Yeah. Not only that, it's a society that not only has a memory, but wants to preserve the memory. This is why forgiveness is somehow, and sometimes so tricky in the context of conflict, because we have this association that forgiveness necessarily involves some kind of forgetting. and just to show that it doesn't have to, that you can have in fact, that most forgiveness does not involve the forgetting of the details of the event, the historical aspects, and so on. Memory is preserved even in light of forgiveness.
Yeah, thank you so much. Then thank you everybody for being here with us this afternoon. It's 1 p.m. We try to be right there on time. Remember, this is the first of a series called 5 Why of Peace Colombia. Our next event is next Tuesday. We'll be screening a fantastic documentary called Under Siege about what happens with farmers, peasants that had been in between two wars, right? The internal Colombian conflict and the global war against drugs. And what happens when you are in the middle of these two wars in a very convoluted region of Colombia, beautiful to the Cauca. Then this is at 6:30 p.m. Just go to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies site. You will get information. We'll be rotating this. We'll be back with more March 23, 1 month from now, on this right here at Wences at the Center. What comes next in the Colombian peace process? We'll have a fantastic group of graduate students now publishing op-eds for the Washington Post, presenting their vision, and we'll end the series at Wences at the Center Wednesday, March 30th, with Embodied Enlightenments, a launching of a fantastic volume on cultural production and human rights in Colombia. Felipe, thank you so much. We know you have to run for the airport now. We want to celebrate this grant, and we want to be following it and helping in any way and form. Thank you very much, everybody, and Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me and for being here. Really appreciate it.
Good. Well, thank you, Professor De Brigard. Thank you, Dr. Sotelo. And thank you for that on-time, insightful conversation. And thanks for all the attendees who came out today. Wednesdays at the Center will continue next week, March 2nd, with a conversation about the study of spirituality and Asian religions in the global age with Duke University's Anna Sun, Brian Steensland, and Jaime Kusinkas. So thank you, everyone, and we hope we will get to see you next Wednesday, March 2nd. Thank you and have a great day.
Bye.